Well, good evening, Raleigh Road Baptist Church. If you remember last Wednesday night, we began to look at Simon Peter. First couple of weeks, we looked at Matthew, and we did part one of Simon Peter last week, and we talked about how Jesus called him to be a disciple and talked a little bit about some of the things that the book of Acts says about Paul. We're going to, Peter. We're going to continue tonight in part two, and we begin with this question. Did Peter, in his ministry, evangelize that area north of Rome, known as Britain and Gaul in those days? Now, we know that Britain, of course, is what we call England today, Ireland and Scotland, Great Britain. But Gaul, you may not be familiar with that term. That is an area that today includes the countries of France, Luxembourg, Switzerland, northern Italy, and the Netherlands. So our question here to begin tonight is, did Peter go up into those areas and preach the gospel? Well, the consensus is, from church historians and theologians, is that there is a great deal of evidence that Peter visited Britain and Gaul several times. His last visit, as a matter of fact, to Britain came shortly before he was arrested and crucified in Rome by the Emperor Nero. While he was preaching in Paul, Peter was so highly thought of that he became the patron saint of Chartres. Now, Chartres is a city in France that is located kind of southwest of Paris. And it's a very famous city due to the fact that it contains the oldest cathedral in France. I think you'll recognize the name. It contains the Cathedral of Notre Dame. Not the one in South Bend, Indiana. The Cathedral of Notre Dame is in the city of Chartres. And down through the years, they thought so highly of Peter that they named him the patron saint of Chartres. There have been, down through history, also further discoveries and proofs that Peter not only visited Britain and Gaul, but that he evangelized there. So the answer to the question, did he evangelize the area north of Rome? It seems that he did, yes. Now the next question we want to look at is this. Did Peter actually visit Rome? Remember, the Romans were the chief country in the world in those days, kind of like the United States is today. They're the most powerful country, most powerful military, most powerful economy. So the question is, did Peter go to Rome? Well, it was for many years a tradition that not only that Peter did go to Rome, but that he started the first Christian church there. However, as the years have gone by and people have done more studying of the situation, it's become kind of a common knowledge that there were probably already some Christian churches in Rome before Peter actually visited there. So he probably did not start the first Christian church there. Now, the church historian Eusebius wrote that Peter was in Rome about 44 AD, at the beginning of the reign of the Roman Emperor Claudius. Now, another thing we know about Claudius, now that we've mentioned him, is that in 50 AD, the Christians and the Jews in Rome got to arguing and fussing with each other so bad that Claudius threw the Jews out of Rome. He wouldn't let them stay. Now, why he chose to let the Christians stay and not the Jews, we're not sure, but he kicked the Jews out of Rome in 50 AD because they couldn't get along with the Christians. Now, this seems to indicate then, from what Eusebius wrote, that Peter was in Rome during 44 AD. However, if you remember from last week, we pointed out that Peter was in Babylon from 44 AD to 49 AD. Well, if he was in Babylon in 44 AD, could he have been in Rome during 44 AD? Sure. But what it means is he must have left Babylon for a short time and gone to Rome, because he was primarily in Babylon for about 5 years there, 44 to 49 AD. If Peter had been in Rome for a long period of time, maybe the whole year of 44 AD, I think we'd have probably read about it in the book of Acts. I don't think Luke would have left that out. So evidently, his time in Rome, if he was there at all in 44 AD, was a short period of time. It is believed by most church historians that Peter was killed in Rome by the Emperor Nero and was buried there. So, if this is true, and it is widely believed to be true, then he must have gone to Rome at some time, since he was killed there and buried there. The Protestant theologian and church historian, a man named Adolf Harnack, said this about whether or not Peter was in Rome, and I think this is pretty strong. Dr. Harnack wrote, "To deny the Roman stay of Peter is an error which today is clear to every scholar who is not blind." In other words, Dr. Harnack is saying without a doubt Peter spent time in Rome. But notice he doesn't give an exact date like Eusebius did. Eusebius said 44 AD, when we think that Peter was in Babylon in 44 AD. Harnack just says that he was there at some time. It's also widely believed that not only was Peter killed and buried in Rome, but that Paul was also killed and buried in Rome. Well, you remember last week when we finished up with Matthew, we talked about some stories, some legends about Matthew. Well, there were some about Peter too. Now, the best known story about Peter comes from the book of Acts. And this is really probably not a legend, since it's in the book of Acts, it's probably true. Some people call it legend, but since it was in the canon in the Bible, I think this really happened. There was in the book of Acts a man named Simon the sorcerer, who saw Peter and some of the other apostles heal people. And he went to them and wanted to know how much money it would take to buy the gift of the Holy Spirit so he could heal people and make money off of it. And Peter really denounced him. And matter of fact, Peter told him that he'd better stop thinking that, and he'd better become a Christian, because this type of thing may cost him his life, wanting to buy the Holy Spirit, that he probably make God so angry. And Simon the sorcerer, then begged Peter to show him what he had to do to become a Christian, because he didn't want God to take his life. So Peter denounced Simon the sorcerer in the book of Acts. Now this next one is not in Acts. It probably comes from the Apocrypha. Another legend is that Peter had a daughter. Remember, he was married. And the legend says he had a daughter named Petronilla, and that she accompanied him on several of his evangelical journeys. Now, I said during the time that she was with him that she became very sick with a terrible disease. We're not told what disease it is. But that after many years of suffering with that disease, that God healed her and took the disease away. It is then said that a Roman nobleman, very rich man, very influential and powerful man named Valerius Flaccus fell in love with Petronilla because she was a very beautiful girl, it is said. Well, he fell in love with her and he asked her to marry him. Well, the story goes, as the legend goes, she was afraid to say no to him because he was so important, he was so powerful. She was afraid if she said no that he'd get angry and remember, she was a Christian and he was a Roman, that he might have something done to her, throw her in jail or something. So she told him, yes, I'll marry you, but I want you to give me 3 days to get prepared for our wedding. I want you to leave and go back to your home and come back in 3 days and we'll get married. So he agreed and he left and was gone for 3 days getting ready for the wedding. And during those 3 days, Petronilla, who did not want to marry him, prayed for hour after hour to the Lord to deliver her from this situation. And when Valerius Flaccus returned 3 days later with a large group of people to claim her as his bride, he found her dead in her home. Now, if this is the way that God decided to get her out of this problem, then obviously it was the best way. But it's kind of hard to accept when you realize that this man had put her into such a bad situation. She couldn't get away from him. No matter, even if she ran away, he'd find her. That the only way for her to get out of it was to go out of the world. Now, I don't think she committed suicide, personally, if the story is true. Now, remember, this is a legend. But I don't think she committed suicide. I think God just took her home to heaven. The legend places her death around 98 AD. Now, this was 34 years after Peter had died, after he'd been killed. It is believed, as I mentioned earlier, that not only did Peter die in Rome, did he become a martyr in Rome, but that Paul did too. It is believed that Paul was beheaded, which is one of the ways the Romans killed prisoners, that and crucifixion were their two main ways. And Peter, very famously, it is said, was crucified just like Jesus, but was crucified upside down at his own request, because he did not consider himself worthy to be crucified straight up like his Lord. So he was crucified upside down. It's also fairly certain that Peter had someone traveling with him who wrote down many things that he did, kind of acting as his secretary. And that man should be familiar to you. His name is John Mark, the fellow who wrote the Gospel of Mark. Peter owes, as a matter of fact, much of his fame to Mark, because Mark wrote a lot about Peter in his Gospel. When you get a chance, read the Gospel of Mark and you'll see that Peter is mentioned quite often. Now, one of the ways we know that is a fellow I mentioned in our very first lesson, a church father. Remember, we talked about church historians and church fathers are two of the ways we've learned about the apostles, because they wrote things down. They wrote things that have been discovered. One of the church fathers named Papias recorded in some of his history of the apostles that Mark, John Mark, was the chief secretary, the chief interpreter of what Peter did, and wrote it all down. It's also believed that when Peter went to Rome, he wasn't able to speak the language very well. And so Mark, who was more educated than him, remember now, Peter was a fisherman. He was not highly educated. So it is believed that he took Mark with him when he went to Rome to preach. And Mark served as his translator, because he could speak the Roman language very, very fluently and Peter could not. Matter of fact, the Gospel of Mark is made up of Mark's memory and Mark's notes of the things that he saw Peter do and of the lessons he heard Peter teach and preach about Jesus Christ. That's where the book of Mark comes from. Now, I hope you remember that we mentioned in our discussion of Matthew that both Matthew and Peter used the Gospel of Mark to help them write their own Gospels, because we are pretty sure that Mark wrote the first Gospel and Matthew and Luke we're not sure exactly which order, whether it was Matthew second or Luke second. We do know that John was fourth, so Matthew and Luke were 2, 3 there, that they used Mark to write their own Gospels. Now, because of that, these 3 Gospels are known as the Synoptic Gospels. The word synoptic means similar. I know you all noticed that all 3 Gospels cover some of the same things. And that's because Mark wrote his first and Matthew and Luke used his as one of their sources, not their only source, but as one of their sources to help write theirs. Another one of the legends in ancient literature that I find quite interesting is Peter's physical appearance has even been described. Peter was described as being a tall and slender man. His complexion was said to be pale, almost white, which would be unusual of a Middle Eastern person. His beard was said to be curly, thick, and short. His eyes were said to be black, but that his eyes were flecked with little pieces of red because he cried so much over people who would not listen to the gospel and who were going to be lost, and because of the way he was treated in his life for preaching the gospel. It's also said that, again, kind of an unusual physical thing, that Peter's eyebrows were so thin that you could barely see them. That it almost, unless you got up close, it looked like he didn't even have any eyebrows. So I found this to be quite interesting. Also, some of our more modern archaeological discoveries have unearthed what people think are the actual bones of Peter. Remember, he was killed and buried in Rome. It is believed that his bones were discovered in the 4th century AD, which is the 300s, by the first Christian Roman emperor, a man named Constantine. It's believed that Constantine discovered Peter's burial place and his bones, and he hid them so they would not be stolen or destroyed. Now, the information about these bones say that the bones are of a man about 60 to 70 years old. Now, this falls right in with how old we think Peter was when he was crucified. So that points toward them being Peter's bones, and the fact that they were discovered in an old Roman cemetery in Rome points to the fact that it might have been Peter. The bones were said to have been wrapped in purple and gold cloth, which in that day was a very expensive type of material in a cloth. Today, Peter's bones, or what is believed to be Peter's bones, are buried beneath a huge basilica, which is a Roman church, in Rome. The Roman church was built over that cemetery where Constantine found what he believed, and we still believe today, were Peter's actual grave and bones. So this church was built over that cemetery. a man named Edgar J. Goodspeed, who was an American theologian and Christian scholar. In a book he wrote, he quoted the ancient Christian theologian Clement, and he quoted the ancient church historian Eusebius in some things that they wrote about the last hours of Peter's life before he was led off to be killed. Now, in this, might be surprising to you, that not only was Peter killed, but his wife was also. Evidently, she was there with him in Rome, and when he was arrested, they arrested her, because she was also a Christian. So, Goodspeed writes that Clement and Eusebius wrote the following during the last couple of hours of Peter's life. And Goodspeed writes, Peter's parting words to his wife as she was being led out to become a martyr are recorded by Clement of Alexandria in his Miscellaneouses. Now, his Miscellaneouses were 3 books that he wrote on the life of being an early Christian. Clement wrote 3 books about what life was like for the early Christians. So, Goodspeed is quoting him from those 3 books. And he's also quoting Eusebius, who wrote something very similar in his famous book, Christian Church History. And here's what they said. They said when the blessed Peter saw them come and get his own wife and lead her out to die, that he rejoiced because God was calling her home, that she's going to get out of that terrible prison and that God was going to call her home. And as she walked past his cell on the way out to be killed, Roman guard on each side, that he called out to her and encouraged her, that he addressed her by her name, and that he said the words, "O thou remember the Lord," to his wife as she headed out to be killed by the Romans. Well, that kind of brings us to the end of Peter's life. It wasn't long after his wife was killed that he also was killed. As I mentioned earlier, we're pretty sure that Paul was killed there also. Just to throw in a little Roman and church history here, this was a time period when the Emperor Nero was killing Christians because, just to give you a little Roman history, first off, Nero was crazy as a bat. But Nero wanted to rebuild a lot of Rome. He wanted to tear it down and rebuild it. But evidently, the Roman people wouldn't let him do it. The ruling council that he dealt with there, I don't know exactly what their name was, but they wouldn't let him do it. So the word is that he set Rome on fire, had Rome set afire and burned down so he could, rebuild it. Of course, if word had got out that he'd done it, he would have probably lost his life, so he blamed the Christians for doing it and started crucifying and killing all the Christians. And this is the time period that Peter and Paul got caught up in that and got killed. So they're both, we think, were killed and buried in Rome. All right, that's Matthew and Simon Peter we've covered the last few weeks. Starting next Wednesday night, I'm going to start a new lesson. Again, it'll probably take 2 weeks. And this time we're going to look at Luke. Now, Luke was not strictly one of the apostles, but he wrote one of the 4 Gospels, as we know, and he was the close friend of Paul. Now, Paul is looked at as really being the 13th apostle, I guess you'd say. And there are a lot of people who think that, of course, some people disagree with this, but there are people who think that when the apostles selected Matthias to take Judas's place, that really that wasn't God's will, that God wanted Paul to be the one that took his place. But that we don't know whether that's true or not. But Luke, of course, was Paul's close friend. He wrote the Gospel of Luke. He traveled on missionary journeys with Paul. He wrote the Gospel of Luke. He wrote the book of Acts. And so we're going to take a look over the next couple of weeks at a man I would call an honorary apostle, Dr. Luke. I hope you've enjoyed Matthew and Peter. Hope you've learned some things that you hadn't heard before about them, learned some new things about these two guys, and starting next week, I hope you learn something new about Luke. Hope to see you Sunday morning, 9:30 under the trees as we worship the Lord at Raleigh Road Baptist Church. Take care, and I'll see you soon.